Today's episode will be censored by YouTube, and today's episode contains some of the most horrific stories I've ever discussed. And according to the British government, none of what I'm about to tell you is real. None of it's true, none of this ever happened, even though I'm going to present you with evidence, proof, victim testimony, and so much more. This is the most mind-bending, mind-blowing episode that I've ever produced, and it involves a notorious home in England known as the ELM guest house, which is sort of like the Epstein Island of London. It's a place where the worst things humanly possible happened. Films. Obviously widespread. It was visited by VIPs in the British government and entertainment industry. And this story has much wider, much broader implications. So please buckle in, get ready for today's episode, because this is a truly twisted one. All facts presented in today's show can be independently verified by visiting the resources document in the description. And as always, all parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. With all that being said, let's get into this. Welcome to the Conspiracy Files. There are some places on Earth that God seems to have turned his back on. Places so evil, so demented, that they would make you question the existence of a God in the first place. Venues where evil is allowed to thrive. Places where the devil seems to have taken up a permanent residence. Buildings where films are produced. Homes in which children are routinely and houses where misery and pain stains the walls. One of those places in the 1980s was the ELM guest house in London, England, a home shrouded in mystery and conspiracy, and the location of some of the most infamous and disturbing crimes against children in British history. But according to officials, nothing ever happened at the guest house. In fact, according to the authorities in England, none of the following information that I'm about to tell you is true. I'm lying to you, this is one big lie. But that itself is a lie. And today I'm going to be exposing some of the British government's darkest secrets. Secrets that they do not want you to hear. Children with no family or family in a position to take care of them are some of the most vulnerable in society. Many rely on government funding and placement in foster care to survive. And while there are indeed many good foster care facilities and families out there, there are also many who submit those in their care to horrendous. This is one of those stories, the story of the ELM guest house and all of the interconnected organizations and evil people involved with it. And it should be noted that some of the terminology in this story may differ from that commonly used in North America. For example, the phrase local authority care refers to children in the UK who are under the care of the government. There are other distinctions in this story, but we'll talk about them along the way. In the early part of the 1980s, it's alleged that boys from the Grafton Close Children's Home, run by the Richmond Borough Council in southwest London, were preyed upon by a ring that was operating out of a nearby location named the ELM Guest House. The ELM Guest House was a gay-friendly establishment where it was said that underage boys from the Grafton Close Children's Home were brought to have relations with adult men. Underage were also said to frequent the home. It's of note to mention that the homosexual age of consent at this time in the UK was 21. This is higher than the heterosexual age of consent at the time. The perpetrators of these crimes were said to be important people. Some were said to be members of parliament or MPs. There was a member of the royal family accused, an MI5 officer, pop stars, a member of the National Front, members of Sinn Féin, and a Soviet spy, amongst others. Harun Kassir from India and his wife Carol from Germany were the operators of ELM Guest House at the time that our story takes place. It was advertised in the gay press as a place where homosexual men could meet. The newsletter for the conservative group for homosexual equality strongly recommended the guest house. This was a newsletter that was read by a lot of politicians and powerful people. Neighbors of the guest house at the time thought that it was a brothel because people were constantly going in and out at all hours of the night. The guest house was raided in 1982 and the homeowners were charged with running a disorderly house. They were eventually convicted, fined, and given suspended sentences. Any other charges related to that police raid were dropped. But before we get into all of this information, we first need to provide a little bit of context. The ELM Guest House was a 3-story Edwardian property located on Rocks Lane near Barnes Common in southwest London, which once featured 8 guest rooms and amenities such as a sauna, a solarium, and a video studio. It was advertised in those gay-friendly publications at the time as being a place where homosexual members of society, who at the time were somewhat prosecuted across the globe for their sexual orientations, could let loose. themselves, be free, and live life on their own terms. It was indeed a popular spot, and reservations at the ELM Guest House were sometimes hard to secure. ELM Guest House placed advertisements in specialist gay publications in the 1980s, including, like I said, that newsletter for the conservative group for homosexual equality. But interestingly, in that advertisement, it stated the facilities include a sauna, solarium, and video studio. They put it right there out in the open. So apparently, from the surface, the ELM Guest House was a friendly, welcoming spot for people to come relax at. The official narrative that the government in the UK is still going with today, then the ELM Guest House was never anything more than that. A hotel for gay individuals where they could relax and unwind, where never took place. It was a building filled with sunshine, happiness, and love. Nothing to see here, essentially. But researchers who have dived really deep into this story know that that's just not the case. Today, the building has been converted into 2-bedroom apartments, with its current residents having no connection to the past allegations. For, as you're going to see throughout all of this, the British government has tried its hardest to distance itself from the allegations and firestorm that surrounded the ELM Guest House. They've almost tried to remove those words from the vernacular of the English language. They've tried their hardest to renovate the home, resell it, and force society at large to move on. But as we know here on this channel, when there's smoke, there's fire, and the smoke surrounding the ELM Guest House was more like a massive sandstorm that completely blocked out the sun. This is the real story of the ELM Guest House. The story starts in June of 1982 when the property was raided by local authorities. So there were a couple things that led to this initial raid on the ELM Guest House. But the initial investigation began after a 10-year-old boy received medical care after he was and claimed that, at the time, he had been living inside of the ELM Guest House and had been by multiple older men. The allegations of made by the child were confirmed by a medical exam, which indeed showed that he had been repeatedly over a prolonged period of time. The boy also stated to the authorities that he called one of his Uncle Leon, and this person could have possibly been a politician. You'll understand the significance of that name in a moment. And this allegation was one of the couple that really kicked this thing off. One major driving factor and impetus behind the raid was research and information that was gathered there, while on the property, inside of the guest house, by 2 undercover officers from a local police department. You see, in the late 70s and 80s, allegations had been made by multiple victims that they, as minors, had been by individuals while they were inside the ELM Guest House. At first, these reports were ignored, but eventually, for some reason or another, the authorities decided that they were actually going to do their jobs and investigate some of these claims. So, they came up with a plan to gather information about just what exactly may have been going on at the guest house, which, just to remind you again, was a boutique hotel, health spa, and club that catered to homosexual men. 2 male officers donned disguises, created cover stories, and went undercover to the guest house, posing as a homosexual couple. According to testimony, at one point while they were inside of the guest house, one of the officers claimed that they asked a staff member if children might be part of the offered there, and that answer from an employee of the ELM Guest House had been, yes, children were a part of the offered at the home. This was enough information for them to get the paperwork pushed through to enact a raid on the property, but they weren't done gathering information yet. You see, through conversations with other staff that they engaged in that evening, the undercover officers also discovered that a retired, powerful judge acted as the house's legal advisor. Weird. After spending the night talking to the predator members of the ELM Guest House that were in attendance that night, the officers were then formally invited to a sauna party the following week by one of the guest house associates. They were also told that around 200 guests would be attending. This, they thought, would be huge. Here you had a house supposedly filled with prominent individuals who were pimping out for their use at their parties and in the in-house video studio. And now the 2 undercover officers had been invited to another gathering at the Predator Palace, a party with many more attendees and assumedly a lot of illegal things happening. And so, acting on this gathered intel, a date was set and a raid was planned by London authorities. On the evening of the bust, those same 2 undercover officers first showed up alone and entered the ELM Guest House, wanting to confirm that there was a party going on, and to scope out the interior and check out the exact situation that they were going to be dealing with. But things didn't go as planned. According to the authorities at the time, throughout all of these exchanges, one of the undercover officers had been wearing a fake cast to hide a wiretap recording device. They had wanted to capture these powerful people admitting to their crimes against children on an audio recording. And so, on the evening of the raid, those 2 officers donned their disguises and their wiretaps and knocked on the front door of the guest house. They were immediately met with a raucous scene. There was indeed a small party at the Elm guest house, and in attendance, according to these officers, were some recognizable individuals that would be known by the general public. But at the very beginning of the evening, as they entered the home and began to take in their surroundings, the two undercover officers were greeted by one of the owners and operators of the hotel, a woman named, like we said before, Carol Cassier. Carol, recognizing the officers from the week before, began chatting the men up and at one point went in for a hug. But somehow, this hug pulled the wrong wire and put pressure on the wrong spot, which caused the wiretap device to go AWOL and begin making noise and playing police radio chatter out loud. Immediately, both the officer's eyes and Carol's eyes grew wide, and at that moment, Carol knew that the two were police officers, and the officers knew that they had been exposed. Immediately, the authorities waiting outside of the guest house sprung into action, and the raid was executed, with armed members of London police busting in through the front doors and yelling at everyone to remain still. Now, interestingly enough, to this day, we still don't know exactly what the authorities discovered inside of the Elm guest house that evening. We don't have a full list of the names of individuals that were found inside the home. We don't have a list of the materials recovered. And to be honest, information in general regarding this raid is extremely sparse. There are barely any newspapers detailing this incident online and very few official reports. And in addition, the stories from the authorities about this raid and what happened / what they found that night have changed many times since the original reporting. It seems like the police had stumbled into a den of darkness that they weren't meant to discover, and they were about to be silenced themselves. But we do know a few key details about the guest house and the raid, details that were gathered from newspaper reports at the time, and some leaked documents and the testimonies of people that were involved. Following the raid, reports emerged claiming that visitors to the Elm guest house were provided with a menu offering sexual services, including the ability to purchase sex with boys as young as 10 years old. According to testimony, the printed menu featured information about exactly which sex acts you could purchase, information about exactly who you could purchase those acts from, and prices for each. Now, according to the quote official story, I use the word official because it's not official, it's just a lie, a cover-up. Less than 10 individuals were snagged in this sting at the guest house. However, we now know that there were in reality more men present inside of the Elm guest house that evening, and in fact, that during the raid, 23 different men were reportedly detained. 23 is a much higher number than less than 10. Why would the authorities lie about this? Were there people inside of the house that they didn't want to document seeing inside of there? Well, you'll see why soon. When the authorities searched the hotel / home, they found what could only be described as a torture chamber. According to reports, the townhouse was described as having bedroom suites adorned with whips, chains, and ropes, alongside communal areas featuring a lounge, bar, spa, sauna, and a screening room for pornography. According to police sources, among the guests that were found inside of the Elm guest house that evening were 3 parliamentary ministers, high-ranking members of the British government, and a member of the Queen's royal staff. Interestingly though, it seemed that just moments after the raid was finished, the authorities began to distance themselves from their own actions. They denied details that leaked to the press about the affair. They remained tight-lipped about what they found inside of the home. And it really seemed like they just wanted the public to forget that they had even conducted a raid in the first place. Just take a look at this quote from the British newspaper News of the World from August 8, 1982, just a month and a half after the initial raid. A Scotland Yard official said, "It is just a routine investigation into a brothel, something that goes on all the time." But a source close to the investigation said, "The top brass have ordered everything to be played down. Officially, we aren't saying anything at this stage. Every attempt is being made to make sure the names of the VIPs who have been using this place don't leak out." And with that, the cover-up had already begun before the affair had really ever started in the first place. In another newspaper article published on the same day as the previous article, the authorities flat out denied that anything out of the ordinary had been found during their routine check-in at the Elm guest house. The article from the Sunday Times on August 8, 1982 states, claims that a police investigation into an alleged homosexual brothel had revealed a possible security risk were denied yesterday by Scotland Yard. The Metropolitan Police confirmed that 4 people had been charged after allegations that gay sex was for sale at a London suburban guest house. The Daily Express reported yesterday that at least 30 men prominent in public life, including 3 MPs, were believed to have been named after undercover inquiries and that security officials were called in. But the Yard said yesterday that the special branch, which is automatically called in whenever questions of security arise, was not taking part in inquiries. As author Simon Dovey claims in his book, The Eye of the Chicken Hawk, which by the way is a book I highly recommend everybody read. I really want to get Simon on this show soon. He provided a lot of great evidence that I used in this script, so thank you so much, Simon. This cycle of information being released and then subsequently denied by the authorities can be explained. On page 117 of Eye of the Chicken Hawk, Dovey writes, "The mixed reporting appears to be the result of a pretty common phenomenon. Law enforcement officers at the operational level of an investigation leak information to the press, which is then subsequently denied in official statements given by their administrative superiors, who have to deal with the political ramifications." Now, interestingly enough, after this initial raid, the owners of the ELM guest house, Haroon and Carol Kassir, were officially charged for keeping a disorderly house and for the possession of pornography. However, later on, the charge for the possession of CP, by the way, I'm going to shorten that phrase, those words that I just said before, into CP to avoid censorship, so you know what I'm saying when I say CP, was dropped by the authorities after a total of 7 hours. 7 hours of video footage that was discovered and seized from the premises of the ELM guest house was ruled as inadmissible in court. A court document from the time states, "By agreement with the defense lawyers, the prosecution has slashed 8 hours of videos that were to be shown to the court to just 45 minutes. The judge made an order forbidding the press to say anything which might identify the child in the case. Reporting restrictions were not lifted." Immediately, that's incredibly bizarre. Here we have the authorities admitting to the fact that they had uncovered hours and hours of CP materials inside of the ELM guest house, and yet they refused to prosecute the people who were officially in possession of it, and refused to do really anything about it at all. It's as if they found the CP, took one look at all the material, and then threw it in the trash and moved on. I do find it interesting that if a normal citizen is found to be in possession of materials like these, they're immediately arrested, added to a sex offender registry, and their lives are forever changed. But why did the charges against Carol and Haroon get thrown out? Could they have had powerful friends protecting them? Were they just the tip of the iceberg? You'll see soon enough. Now we have to move forward to the next year, 1983, the year after the initial raid of the ELM guest house in 1982. In 1983, a Tory MP, or a British politician named Geoffrey Dickens, put together a list of names based on what he was hearing about what really happened at the ELM guest house. Geoffrey, as it turned out, knew some things and had access to materials that weren't public information at the time, and had concluded that the predator ring rumored to be in operation at the time at the guest house was indeed very real, was very dangerous, and that something had to be done to stop these monsters from victimizing children. Geoffrey stated at the time that the list he was compiling would blow the lid off and expose a ring consisting of powerful and famous child predators that had infiltrated the British government and entertainment industry. After working on the list, gathering information and compiling evidence, the list was then given to the Home Secretary at the time, Leon Brittain. Remember the name Leon? He's going to come up a few more times in our story. To put this into perspective for American audiences, the Home Secretary in England, Leon Brittain's position, is a very powerful figure in the British government and is in a role equivalent to that of the US Attorney General or Secretary of Homeland Security. At the time that this list was received, Home Secretary Leon Brittain acknowledged receiving the list by sending a letter to Geoffrey, the man who created the list, suggesting that the police had been informed and that the list was being passed on to the proper authorities. So to Geoffrey, who made the list, it seemed like it was going well. He had compiled this list, gathered all this information, handed it over to the top cop in England. He had sent him a letter saying, "We're passing this on to the right people and we're going to get justice for these kids." And a newspaper report published in the Red Deer Advocate on August 25th, 1983 confirms this, stating, "Several public figures have been named in a Scotland Yard dossier on child." A member of British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party said Wednesday. Geoffrey Dickens, a campaigner against CP, said in a radio interview that he has compiled a list of names and plans to disclose them in Parliament. The Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions confirmed it is studying a report on a police inquiry into a group called Information Exchange. Interior Minister Leon Brittain has ordered a copy of the report by Friday. His officials said, Jeffrey Dickens said the Scotland Yard report, like his own dossier, contains the names of a number of top people in public life and show business. Another newspaper article published at the time confirming this information stated, British Home Secretary Leon Brittain is studying allegations of a homosexual vice ring in Buckingham Palace, a government spokesman said Friday. The allegations came from MP Jeffrey Dickens, who compiled a massive dossier alleging that young males who joined the palace staff as footmen, cooks, or servants are being dragged into a web of vice. Vice and everything essentially meaning a predator ring. However, this wasn't the case. Nothing happened, and the list was never mentioned or seen again. Yes, you heard that correctly. The list of prominent individuals that were involved in this predator ring that was given directly to the Home Secretary of the UK vanished into thin air, and to this day, it's never been located. In fact, in 2013, when interest in this affair was reinvigorated, Jeffrey Dickens' list and the evidence and files that went along with it were looked for again, and were again not found. Another look for the files was ordered again in 2014 by Prime Minister David Cameron. But the Dickens list just so happened to be only one of 114 files that officials could not find. It seems as though after the list was handed over to the Home Secretary, Leon Brittain, it was either hidden, destroyed, or tossed to the wind, never to be seen again. Strange. And Jeffrey Dickens himself, the guy who wrote that list and put in all the work to compile that information, talk to victims, list names and find information, shortly after having his name published in news sources as being the predator ring whistleblower, he began receiving threats. In fact, it was just a short time after Jeffrey first handed the dossier over in August of 1983 when anonymous death threats began arriving on his answering machine and in his mailbox. In addition, his home was burglarized multiple times by unknown assailants, people who broke into his residence in the middle of the night or in the broad daylight, seemingly in an attempt to send some sort of a message. It should be noted that even though these people were breaking into Jeffrey's home, they were never stealing anything. So, something to think about. A short while later, a notebook was discovered by the authorities, a notebook that belonged to a man that, at the time, was an on-the-run fugitive wanted for a triple murder named Arthur Hutchinson. When Arthur's notebook was examined by authorities, Jeffrey Dickens' name and other personal details, including his home address, were found scribbled on a lonesome page in the notebook. Taking this as a credible threat against Jeffrey's life, after this discovery, a security detail was placed on him for a number of weeks, until Arthur Hutchinson was eventually apprehended. So, did somebody give Jeffrey Dickens his name and information to this wanted murderer in an effort to have him killed and taken out? I don't know, it's pretty weird though. It seemed that at the time, trying to expose this predator ring had landed MP Jeffrey Dickens on a hit list, and things were about to get so much messier. In 1990, new information was brought to the attention of the general public through the investigation into the death of the ELM Guesthouse's former owner, Carol Cassier. Remember Carol, the woman who was running the ELM Guesthouse at the time of the first police raid, who hugged the officer and set off his recording device? Well, she was found dead in 1990. She had allegedly her own life with insulin. Carol, like myself, was a diabetic, and according to the authorities, one day she decided she had had enough of life and injected herself with a massive dose of insulin, laid down in her bed, went to sleep, and never woke up. However, files released almost 30 years later in 2017 cast doubt on this official story. According to this article published in the Daily Mirror, pathologist Richard Shepard said Carol's death was not due to natural causes, noting her profound low blood sugar was consistent with excessive injected insulin. One abnormality raised in the files is a decision by the poison unit at the New Cross Hospital in London not to analyze the syringes and vials found next to her body to see if they were connected to her death or to check her stomach contents. Experts say this should have been normal practice in a toxicology report. The article also talked about how those in Carol's life, including her own doctor, who she had been seeing for 14 years, were completely dumbfounded by her decision to end her own life. In the article, Carol's former doctor, a man named David Walker, stated, "When there are marital difficulties, you see the patient in a depressed light. Sometimes she was cheerful and friendly. I would not expect her to commit blank." But regardless of the mystery surrounding her own death, after Carol died in 1990, an individual from the National Association of Young People in Care, or NAYPIC, named Mary Moss called for a criminal investigation into the events at the ELM Guesthouse, and Mary Moss was about to blow this whole thing wide open. For years, Mary Moss had been working with underprivileged, abused youths to try help rehabilitate them and help them get over their struggles. And it was through her work and her work associations that Mary had become acquainted with children who had allegedly been victimized at the ELM guest house, and eventually Carol Cassier, the ELM guest house's previous owner. During the subsequent investigation, after oath, Mary Moss testified and told the authorities that Carol had told her in 1989, the year before her self-unaliving, that she was still in possession of proof of the events that occurred at the ELM guest house. Mary even stated that Carol had showed her some of these CP images that she had kept, which depicted recognizable members of the British government posing with children. According to Mary, Carol, in total, had claimed that she was in possession of photos and videos of various visitors to the ELM guest house, one of whom was a bishop. Mary also testified that the ELM guest house was being supplied children by a number of foster homes and care homes in the London area, including an organization known as the Grafton Close Children's Home. According to a newspaper report at the time published on August 10, 1990, in the Surrey Comet, speaking of the Grafton Close Children's Home, quote, "It was alleged the home, run by Richmond Council, supplied boys under the age of 14 to the Gay Guest House, or the ELM Guest House, during the early 1980s, said to be frequented often by top MPs and judges." But how exactly did kids from Grafton Close end up at the ELM Guest House? Well, according to Mary Moss, Carol Cassier had been involved with a group of pornographers that were linked to the Grafton Close Children's Home management and had been in fear for her life in the days, weeks, and months leading up to her random death. During this inquest, it was revealed that an ex-boyfriend of Carol's had also claimed that she had told him that she had several photographs of VIPs at the guest house committing various acts with underage boys, including photos of Cyril Smith, a politician that we'll talk about in a moment. According to the ex-boyfriend, Carol had said that she was offered £20,000 by somebody for the photographs, but she thought that they were worth more. The photographs were said to be locked up in a safety deposit box at one of the Royal Bank of Scotland branches. But just like always in these stories, that safety deposit box was never located, and the photographs in question were never recovered. There was also a man named Christopher Fay who appeared during the investigation proceedings alongside Mary Moss, the whistleblower, who claimed that Carol had showed him evidence of the predator ring's existence as well. According to a newspaper report at the time, Christopher stated that Carol had personally shown him a photo of, quote, a former Tory cabinet minister in a sauna with naked boys, and that, quote, a bishop, a high court judge, social services director, and top businessmen were also among those captured on video at the hotel. End quote. Interestingly enough, it would eventually be revealed that the cabinet minister in question, who allegedly appeared in that photograph with the nude underage boy, was none other than Leon Brittain, the Home Secretary to whom Geoffrey Dickens had turned over the list of names in 1983. Yes, you heard that correctly. The man who had been trusted to uphold the law in England, who had received the dossier exposing the alleged predator ring, had allegedly been a member of that ring the entire time. A newspaper report from the time describing Christopher Fay's allegations stated, quote, Fay, now 69, claimed on oath that Brittain had been involved in abuse and that in May 1990, he had seen a photograph of the former Tory politician in a French maid's uniform with a young boy, end quote. But this wasn't Leon Brittain's first brush with the law in regards to crimes against children. Later on, in the year 2014, decades after the ELM guest house raid, a customs official named Marjanio Solanki told detectives that he stopped Leon Brittain at the port of Dover in the late 1980s on a routine check of his luggage. And when his items had been inspected, it was discovered, according to this agent, that Leon Brittain had been attempting to travel into the United Kingdom from Amsterdam with CP in the trunk of his car. The Telegraph published an article about this incident on July 4th, 2014 that stated, quote, a senior Tory politician said to be part of a was allegedly stopped by a customs officer with CP videos but got off scot-free, police have been told. The former MP was driving back to the UK via Dover when a customs officer pulled him over because he was acting suspiciously. The border guard, who is now retired, has told detectives that when he searched the MP's car, he found videotapes of children clearly under the age of 12, taking part in acts. He passed the material on to his superiors, but the MP was never arrested or charged. Also, remember that young 10-year-old boy that started off this whole affair at the beginning, who told the authorities that one of the perpetrators who had victimized him was a man who he nicknamed Uncle Leon, that he believed could have been a politician? Could Uncle Leon have been Leon Brittain? I'll just leave that there for you to decide. Another parliamentary minister named during this investigation by Mary and Chris was an infamous former member of the British Parliament named Cyril Smith. Cyril was a boisterous, large man who had been involved in British politics for most of his life. At the time of his death, just like with Jimmy Savile, Cyril Smith was held in somewhat high regard by most of the British public. But shortly after he passed on September 3rd, 2010, information would come to light that showed that throughout his entire life, Cyril Smith had been a violent abuser and a hardcore child predator. As it turned out, Cyril Smith, a prominent British politician and former MP for the Rockdale district, had faced widespread allegations of child spanning decades, many of which emerged after his death in 2010. You see, as far back as the 1960s and 70s, Cyril Smith was accused of physically and young boys at hostels and care homes, often under the guise of disciplinary action or impromptu medical examinations. Police investigations into the allegations occurred in 1970, 1998, and 1999, after Cyril had been accused by children of but for some reason, Cyril Smith was never prosecuted. Reports at the time of each set of allegations suggested that Cyril's influence and connections to powerful figures allowed him to escape justice. Time and time again, it seemed as though he was protected. And these allegations were dark. Some of Cyril's victims alleged that he had subjected them to severe physical, mental, and including beatings, and with one boy claiming that he was by Cyril Smith so hard that he lost some of his teeth and required stitches. Later investigations revealed that the police and Crown Prosecution Service decisions not to charge Smith were influenced by political and institutional pressures. People in the upper echelons of the British government had stepped in every single time that these allegations had been made, had silenced the victims, and ensured that their favorite predator politician, Cyril Smith, was allowed to walk free and abuse whomever he liked. In fact, in the 1980s, Cyril Smith was found to be in possession of CP, but as you can probably guess by now, he was never charged with a crime and he was allowed to walk free. There's actually an interesting anecdote about this arrest that I found online. You see, after he was reportedly arrested for the possession of CP, an independent investigation into the incident by a journalist named Donald Hale turned up evidence that showed that Cyril Smith himself, after being arrested and booked into the local jail, had made a mysterious phone call while in custody. And soon afterwards, I'm talking like an hour or two after this phone call, the officers came into the room, uncuffed him, let him out of the jail, and never filed charges. It was later found out, though, that the people who intervened in that whole affair, who stepped in and told the local officers you have to let him go and not charge him, was MI5. MI5 being the British equivalent of the CIA. So you got MI5 stepping in, messing with investigations, and telling local police departments that they need to open up the doors and let the child predators out for some reason. I feel like I've heard this story before. Weird. In the 2010s, after Cyril's death, renewed scrutiny led to further allegations of abuse at Rockdale's Knollville Residential School and the Elm Guest House, where Cyril Smith was implicated as being a member and guest. An MP or British politician from Cyril Smith's own district, Rockdale, named Simon Danchuk, shortly afterwards came out in the news and alleged that Cyril Smith had violently his victims. At the time, Danchuk said, "There is no doubt that Cyril Smith seriously young boys. Why the CPS didn't prosecute more recently is puzzling." It seemed like even members of the British government itself didn't understand why the British government had acted the way that it did decades prior. And these allegations and accusations opened up the floodgates. Soon dozens, hundreds of victims of Cyril Smith came forward and told their stories to investigators, news outlets, and newspapers with harrowing accounts, including stories of minors being forced up on tables and forced to spread themselves so that Cyril Smith could perform disturbing medical examinations on them. Some accused Cyril of being part of a network of predators who exploited their positions to target vulnerable children. And shortly afterwards, a 2014 police investigation identified at least 21 suspects in this historic predator ring, including Cyril Smith, and uncovered evidence of organized abuse at the Knoll View Residential School. As it turned out, Cyril Smith wasn't only involved in the Elm Guesthouse predator ring, he was also documented to have been involved in a whole different predator ring operating out of the Knoll View School located in his hometown, where powerful people had been paying staff members to come in and have relations with children. Investigations into this predator ring were also hindered by alleged cover-ups, with officers, authorities, and politicians all claiming that police files were seized by MI5, the British CIA, and that whistleblowers had been silenced under the Official Secrets Act, which basically just allows the British government to tell somebody, you can't talk about this or it's illegal and we can arrest and prosecute you. But the worst was yet to come. You see, Cyril Smith had been knighted by the Queen of England in the year 1988, years after he had been discovered to be in possession of CP, and years after the multiple allegations of against him had been made. In May of 2015, declassified and released cabinet office documents revealed that Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, disturbingly, had been informed of the allegations of child abuse that had been made against Cyril Smith before being knighted in 1988, but chose to give him the benefit of the doubt based on the Director of Public Prosecution's decision not to pursue charges due to insufficient evidence. So they knew that he was a predator. They knew. Even the upper echelon, Margaret Thatcher, knew that he was a predator, and yet she still allowed him to become a royal, a knighted person. Shortly afterwards, a BBC Newsnight investigation exposed that Cyril Smith had been arrested in the early 1980s for his involvement in a predator ring separate from the Elm Guesthouse ring, and even weirder, it turned out that somebody in the upper echelon of the British government had called the local police who arrested Cyril for his involvement in that predator ring, and this official ordered these police officers to destroy all evidence related to that predator ring. And officers who had seen and interviewed victims and heard testimony were forced to maintain silence about what they had seen and uncovered because of that Official Secrets Act. Further reports indicated that Cyril Smith had once again at one point been arrested by Northamptonshire police on charges of but had been released again quickly under similarly mysterious circumstances. In 2015, a retired police officer alleged that he was threatened into silence by officials in the government after he discovered Cyril Smith at the home of a known sex offender with 2 intoxicated teenage boys and a plainclothes police sergeant. The officer claimed he was later summoned to a meeting at Stockport Police Station, where he was explicitly instructed to remain silent about the incident by his superiors, which had been triggered by a complaint of lewd behavior witnessed by a newspaper boy in 1988. And just to remind you, all this information about Cyril Smith really became public knowledge after his death in 2010, 20 years after the allegations against him were made by Mary Moss and Christopher Fay during the investigation into the death of former Elm Guesthouse owner Carol Kassir. But let's get back to the Elm Guesthouse. So the inquest into the death of Carol Kassir was held, but nothing ever came from it. Her death was labeled as a self-unaliving, and the public moved on. The details were sealed, the allegations were forgotten. But 2 years later, more news would emerge that was incredibly disturbing. You see, in 1992, a social services director named Peter Righton, the top UK government advisor on child protection services, was arrested after customs officials intercepted CP addressed to him from Amsterdam. Yes, you heard that correctly. The top United Kingdom government advisor on child protection services, the man that was supposed to protect the children of the UK and was in charge of their protection, was arrested on CP charges. In the wake of his arrest, it was revealed that Peter Righton had been a member of a group called the Information Exchange, or PIE, which had previously been named in the Jeffrey Dickens VIP Predator dossier from 1983. 2 years later, in 1994, Peter Righton was arrested once again after a Scotland Yard investigation into allegations of historic at children's homes revealed that Peter Righton, the head of child services in the UK, was a hardcore, absolutely unrepentant predator. A newspaper report from November 9th, 1994 stated the following. Former child care chief Peter Righton has been arrested as part of a nationwide abuse inquiry. Mr. Righton, 68, a leading consultant on children's homes, has been questioned in connection with indecent assaults on children in the London area. This countrywide inquiry followed the closure of New Barns, a school for emotionally disturbed children in Gloucestershire. Staff are now facing abuse charges. Mr. Righton held a senior post with the National Children's Bureau and was a respected figure in the child care field. I mean, that's absolutely insane. It should also be brought up that Peter Righton's name had been brought up in connection with the ELM guest house long before those articles and news reports came out. He was accused as being a part of this ring by multiple individuals, and then it came out that he was actually trying to get some mail order CP shipped to him, which just confirms the allegations to me. So at this point, these allegations that members of the British government were involved in predator activities were starting to be officially confirmed through information leaks, arrests, and documents being unsealed. And finally, in October of 2012, almost 20 years after his second arrest, campaigning Labour MP Tom Watson requested an investigation into the political associations of Predator and PIE member Peter Righton. And at this point, newly reinvigorated police interest in the ELM guest house began. After making his intentions to investigate the ELM guest house affair public, Labour MP Tom Watson received over 200 phone calls from alleged victims, who had, according to them, been abused by public figures associated at the ELM guest house. One individual had information about boys who were from the Grafton Close Children's Home being subject to at the ELM guest house, and after hearing all this, Tom Watson passed this information to the police. At around the same time, Mary Moss, who had testified about what she knew of the ELM guest house in 1990, was thrust back into the limelight. In January of 2013, shortly before they were seized under warrant by police, Mary published notes and documents that she had gathered from Carol Kassir online so that they could be seen and accessed by the general public. But like I said, soon afterwards, those documents and the remaining documents that Mary hadn't managed to upload on time were randomly, after decades, seized by authorities, never to be seen again. It's weird, the ELM guest house started coming back up in the news. Mary Moss had these documents for like decades, and then randomly the police bust into her home, take all of her documents relating to the guest house, which according to Mary had some very important names and information on them, and they just disappear. To this day, it's actually unknown where those documents went or what happened to them. But soon afterwards, two heads of the Grafton Close Children's Home, the children's home that was allegedly supplying boys to be at the ELM guest house, were arrested for predator crimes. Strange. It seemed like every single day the allegations that had been made for decades were becoming less like allegations and more like a despicable reality. Shortly after the arrests of those two men who had been in charge of the Grafton Close Children's Home, Mary Moss accepted an invitation to be interviewed by news station ITV, and during this interview she claimed that the ELM guest house had been used to make CP. According to an article published on February 7th, 2013 in The Independent, quote, asked who visited there, Miss Moss, a former chair of the National Association of Young People in Care, said MPs, all sorts of prominent people. It was a CP racket. I don't think that necessarily anyone would be accused of just simply being perverts. This was a money-making business. She added, one of my cases that walked into the office was a young boy who had been there. And another case was a young boy who had been in another children's home. And it was all linked up. In a nutshell, he, the abuse victim, was at Grafton Close Children's Home and procured for the ELM guest house, where they were filmed to make CP, which was then distributed. Those documents that Mary Moss leaked online were important. They helped to tell a more complete story of the ELM guest house, a story about how exactly the place came to be a bona fide predator palace. According to the leaked documents, Carol Kassir, the former owner and operator of the ELM guest house, had stated that two men named Terry Dwyer and John Rowe had persuaded her to renovate her townhouse into a spa and sauna facility for members of a group called Club Spartacus in the year 1979. We'll talk about Club Spartacus at the end of this episode. But just for context, it's a predator organization that was in part founded by and associated with one of the most infamous predators in American history. But we're going to wait until the end of this episode to discuss that. According to these documents, after agreeing to these renovations and agreeing to convert her home into a meeting ground for Club Spartacus members, Carol Kassir had been put in touch with a man named Peter Glencross, who was a close associate of a known violent predator named John Stamford, who acted as the commercial agent for Spartacus International. To provide proof for these allegations, it should be stated that at the time of this raid, and in the years before it, the ELM guest house had displayed a sign out front which read Club Spartacus. This is a known and reported upon fact that is often left out in the stories of this place. In addition, letter correspondence from Spartacus International addressed to the ELM guest house, dated from 1981, exists as well. A report from from Exaro News, published on February 2, 2013, confirms this information, stating, Mary Moss's papers seized by police name the man who helped turn a guest house into a predator brothel, allegedly used by MPs and other VIPs. Exaro can reveal that the key figure who persuaded Carol Kassir, co-manager of the guest house, to create a haven for homosexual men to have sex with boys is Peter Glencross, who was part of an underground predator network called Spartacus. Files seized by police relating to the ELM guest house were leaked online at one point, and notes on records from an ELM guest house sign-in book were included amongst the photos and documents. Some of the people who allegedly signed into the guest house on these leaked documents were amongst the most powerful in England. Among those named, under alleged monikers, Royal Staffer Anthony Blunt, Cyril Smith, Leon Brittain, blah blah blah, there's so many people on these lists. At this point in 2013, the allegations surrounding the ELM guest house had built up into a frenzy, and the authorities in England knew that they had to do something to appease the public who were crying out for justice. So, in February 2013, the Metropolitan Police in the London area launched an infamous investigation that would come to be known as Operation Fernbridge, that aimed to investigate and expose powerful predators in the British establishment that had been allowed to get away with their crimes for decades. But as it turned out, the authorities had already begun investigating this alleged predator ring back in 2012 under the name Operation Fairbank. During this investigation, authorities had attempted, and I use air quotes because they really didn't do to gather information on the ELM guest house ring and historic that took place at the children's homes in England. During this investigation, many allegations of abuse surfaced, but they went completely uninvestigated and not followed up on. Then, in January of 2013, a year later, Operation Fernbridge was started, which became a very public affair. Operation Fernbridge's primary focus was to investigate those abuse allegations that were made during Operation Fairbank, allegations concerning predator crimes that occurred at the ELM guest house in the late 70s and early 80s. There were over 300 lines of questioning that Scotland Yard had to look into, and hundreds of victims that had come forward to make accusations. The abuse claims included multiple assaults on single individuals and dozens of alleged perpetrators from the upper crust of the British government. And this investigation actually led to the discovery of those two predators who had worked at the Grafton Close Children's Home, Tony McSweeney, a Catholic priest from Norwich, and John Stingmore, the former manager of Grafton Close Children's Home. The priest, Tony McSweeney, would eventually be convicted for his crimes against kids, but something curious happened to John Stingmore. In January of 2015, whilst awaiting his trial, John Stingmore was found dead in his home. He was never given the proper chance to testify about his exact role in the predator ring that he helped operate at the Grafton Close Children's Home, and he took his secrets to the grave. Although the official explanation is that he died due to medical conditions, I'm still a bit suspicious. Here's a guy, a manager of a connected children's home that was allegedly supplying boys to the ELM guest house, who would have overseen the day-to-day operations of the transport and trafficking of these children, and he dies before he can testify about any of his knowledge or make any of his thoughts known? Strange, right? Sadly to say though, even though Operation Fernbridge was off to a good start, it was doomed from the very beginning. In fact, to investigate the hundreds of abuse allegations made against dozens of individuals, only 7 officers were assigned to the investigation, which made their caseloads exhaustive. There was no way that these 7 officers could properly investigate each and every one of these allegations. In addition, only £25,000 was awarded to the investigators by the government to carry out their operation. It was not a lot of money, they were underfunded, they were understaffed, underpaid, and so the operation in regards to the ELM guest house ultimately went nowhere. It should be noted though that the ELM guest house allegations were eventually handed over to the investigators assigned to another operation, Operation Athabasca, and the end of this operation was absolutely insane, but not in a good way. At the end of Operation Athabasca's years-long investigation, on February 14th, Valentine's Day 2019, Metropolitan Police Commander Neil Jerome, who oversaw the operation, gave evidence on Operation Athabasca's findings to the Independent Inquiry into Child. And in this testimony and conclusion, Jerome himself stated an absolutely absurd conclusion. Jerome stated that, quote, and I want to emphasize that this is a quote, "No credible victim has ever come forward alleging a specific offense suffered whilst at ELM Guest House, and that no prominent person had ever been conclusively identified as having a child there," end quote. This was a complete and utter lie. But this is ultimately where the British government still stands on this entire thing to this day. It should be noted, though, that in the wake of Operation Fernbridge, other investigations were started that took a look at other allegations connected to the ELM guest house. Allegations of murder, snuff films, and missing children. And this angle of the investigation began with Operation Orchid. Operation Orchid was an investigation into the activities of a predator ring that was run by an infamous British man named Sidney Cook and his cohort Lenny Smith. To give you a bit of context, Sidney Cook is one of the most infamous child predators in British history. He was the ringleader of a predator gang that is suspected to have abducted, victimized, and murdered up to 20 young boys in Britain in the 1970s and 80s. Lots of these boys, their bodies have never been found, they're officially missing, and they're just suspected to have been victims of Sidney Cook's gang. And these boys were killed and in some of the most disturbing, vile ways possible. We're going to be covering Sidney Cook's story and the Dirty Dozen and all of the children that he's thought to have victimized on an upcoming episode of the show. But for now, you just need to know that Sidney Cook, one of the most evil men on earth, and his good friend / co-conspirator, Lenny Smith, were the definition of evil. They were serial child and murderers. Operation Orchid was actually its own operation that was opened up specifically to take a look at Sidney Cook and the crimes that he engaged in. But during this independent inquiry, connections between Sidney, the Dirty Dozen, his gang, and the ELM guest house were established. You see, a man named Roger Studley, the retired detective chief superintendent who led the operation, stated that through the information they gathered during the course of the operation, he and the other authorities heavily believed that Lenny Smith, one of the leaders of Sidney Cook's predator gang, was believed to have visited the ELM guest house multiple times throughout his life. There were notes in an unredacted intelligence file related to the operation that was leaked at one point that supported this finding. However, Operation Orchid, for some reason or another, didn't seriously look into the ELM guest house, as they didn't believe it was relevant at the time. The operation heard rumors about things going on there, but at that time, they were focused on their primary investigation, which was the children who were abducted and murdered by Sidney Cook and his gang of predators. As part of the operation, Detective Studley began looking into several missing children cases that he located across the UK. And the more he dug into these cases of missing kids, the more perplexed he became. It seemed as though there was a lot of information missing, a lot of investigations that went absolutely nowhere, a lot of notes and information that were never written down or recorded. He stated, every force had its own way of recording things. If a boy had gone missing a few times, they wouldn't even report it. And sometimes they would have a missing person report and it was never followed up. All the information related to Operation Orchid was said to be held within Scotland Yard, the main investigative authority of England. Think of them sort of like the UK's FBI. However, a few years later, a detective who tried to review the files and information gathered on Sidney Cook during Operation Orchid in 1998 found that the information had been lost. It had vanished once again from the evidence rooms. And to give some perspective on the state of the police at the time in England, it was later discovered that nearly 1/3 of the sex offender files for one London police district disappeared. Those files documenting hardcore predators that lurked amongst the people of London had vanished straight from the police evidence room. As it turned out, Scotland Yard's unit assigned to compile information on sex attacks was staffed by only one officer and one secretary. They were underfunded, understaffed, and they suffered for it. But it was through Operation Orchid that some disturbing connections between the ELM guest house and the murders of a few missing children were established. We now need to talk about Vishal Mehrotra. Vishal Mehrotra was an 8-year-old boy who went missing after being abducted from Putney, London. Vishal, who was 8 years old at the time of his disappearance, went missing in July 1981, less than a mile away from the ELM guest house. On July 29, 1981, the day of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer's wedding, the Mehrotra family traveled to London to watch the event. Returning to East Putney around 1:40 p.m., Vishambar Mehrotra went home, leaving his son Vishal and daughter Mamta with their nanny, Carvalho. He gave them £20 each to buy some sweets. After visiting a newsagent, Carvalho took Mamta to buy cough medicine, while Vishal, feeling tired, chose to walk home alone. Carvalho accompanied him across the main road before parting ways, and she and Mamta returned home at around 3 p.m., assuming that Vishal had just gone out to play. By 4:30 p.m., Vishal was still missing, prompting Carvalho and Vishambar to search the neighborhood. Unable to locate him, they reported his disappearance to the Metropolitan Police at 7 p.m. Vishal would remain missing for over half of a year, but eventually the upper part of his torso was found 7 months later, buried in a wooded area of West Sussex. A few months after Vishal's disappearance, his father was contacted by a man who identified himself as a male prostitute, who suggested that his son's abduction may be tied to a group of high-profile predators who were often at the ELM guest house. On the call, the Phantom Man specifically told Vishal's father that his son may have been taken to the ELM guest house and murdered by a group of highly placed predators. Years later, in 2014, Vishal's father, Vishambar, stated this to the press. "I was contacted by a young man who seemed to be in his 20s. He told me he believed Vishal may have been taken by predators in the ELM guest house near Barnes Common. He said there were very highly placed people there. He talked about judges and politicians who were little boys." The phone call was taped and was passed on to detectives, but Vishambar was told not to think too hard about it because the police believed this was nothing more than a prank phone call. And because of this conclusion that the whole thing was a prank phone call, the allegations were never looked into. The man who reached out to Vishal's father, who has never been publicly identified, also told him that he had already informed the police about the activities of politicians, judges, and other high-profile people who were victimizing boys at the ELM guest house. But no one ever followed up with this man on his statement. It's still, like I said, an uninvestigated lead. There was also another child who had gone missing from an area very close to the ELM guest house 2 years earlier in 1979. And this is disturbing. The child who disappeared was named Martin Allen and was the son of Chief Chauffeur of Australian High Commissioner Sir Gordon Freeth. That's right, Martin's family worked in politics and were in close proximity to politicians every single day. In fact, Martin's family lived in the caretaker's cottage located directly on the grounds of the commissioner's residence. So not only was Martin's family directly tied into the political orbit of powerful people in London at the time, but they also lived on the same property as one. In newspaper reports at the time, it was reported that Martin's father, immediately after his disappearance, for some reason or another, believed that his son had been abducted by a gang of predators in order to make CP. And after Vishal was then abducted and disappeared 2 years later in 1981, it was publicly reported that the Metropolitan Police believed that both boys were abducted by the same gang. This fact was even reported in newspapers, as reported in Daily Star on August 10, 1982, which was quoted as saying, "Vice Squad officers probing London's homosexual scene have reopened their files on 2 schoolboys who went missing. Vishal Malhotra, 8, was found murdered 7 months after disappearing on the royal wedding day last year. Martin Allen, 15, son of the chauffeur to the Australian High Commissioner in London, has never been found after being whisked away by an unknown man. Both cases have connections with southwest London, where police have raided a gay guest house. Vishal was last seen in Upper Richmond Road, Putney, just a mile and a half from the guest house. Martin, of Kensington, was picked up as he approached King's Cross Station. Police believe many prominent people are linked with homosexual vice rings involving young boys." Oh yeah, I forgot to add that in there. Martin was seen getting into a car with a total stranger, and no one's ever figured out who that was or who this guy was that was with him. In a later interview, Kevin Allen, the older brother of Martin Allen, the missing boy, revealed that the two had frequently washed government vehicles at the commissioner's residence and other buildings associated with the Australian embassy. Interestingly, following Martin's disappearance in 1979, Australian intelligence reportedly launched an internal investigation into stand-in drivers employed by a private chauffeur company used by the Australian High Commission. This company, which provided drivers for civic functions often attended by individuals connected to Margaret Thatcher's circle, was found to have employed several convicted child predators. That's a documented fact. This driver service, the chauffeur service that catered to these politicians, that a lot of politicians connected to Margaret Thatcher's government used, was staffed by a number of child predators. And among those drivers that were previously employed by this service was Sidney Cook, the notorious Predator Gang leader who's thought to be responsible for the deaths of over 20 children, and David Smith, the personal driver of the demon formerly known as Jimmy Savile, who died of a heroin overdose just before his trial relating to Jimmy Savile's crimes. The events in question also implicated prominent figures such as Peter Morrison, Margaret Thatcher's private secretary and an alleged predator, Peter Heyman, a deputy director of MI6 and a known and documented predator, and Leon Brittain, Margaret Thatcher's home secretary, who we already discussed extensively. This dark spiderweb of connections raises many troubling questions about the environment surrounding Martin Allen's disappearance. But still, even though these links were discovered, nothing ever happened. And this is public knowledge. The following excerpt was published on February 1st, 2015 in an article by The Australian, a news outlet based in Australia. Kevin says it was standard practice for the High Commission to supplement its regular drivers with stand-in and casual drivers from a particular chauffeur firm located just across the Thames. His research has revealed that this chauffeur firm had, at various times, employed Sidney Cook, whose gang, the Dirty Dozen, would later be convicted and jailed for the torture and murder of 3 young boys in the 80s. Jimmy Savile's chauffeur, David Smith, who unalived himself last year before standing trial on charges, is believed to have links to the same car company in the late 70s. Sidney Cook and his Predator cohort are understood to have been some of the drivers who would pick up young care home boys and rent boys in the expensive cars and deliver them to organized orgies in Barnes, Pimlico, and Kensington. But even though all this information was well known, publicized, and documented, nothing ever happened. No arrests were made, no questions were answered, and the chase for the killers of Martin Allen and Vishal Malhotra went cold. 10 years after Vishal's death in 1991, a detective from London Metro contacted his father and said he was going to reopen the investigation into Vishal's death, but the detective never followed up, and Vishal's father never heard from him again. Then, in November 2014, 23 years later, something unbelievable happened. The Metropolitan Police began their most infamous investigation and publicly stated that they were opening a homicide investigation surrounding allegations that children had been killed by predators linked to 2 establishments that were in operation over 30 years ago, the ELM Guest House and Dolphin Square Apartments. Immediately upon seeing this news, Vishal's father thought that this inquiry should look into his son's death. In 2014, at the start of that operation, a detective, Jackie Malton, who investigated Vishal's death, publicly stated that she was worried that there was a cover-up in regards to the ELM Guest House predator ring. She believed that the murder investigation may have been compromised due to the power of various politicians at the time. A source that was close to the investigation stated that the investigators would check the homicide database on child murders to see if they could link any of the deaths to new information that the police had received over the past few decades. Vishal's murder is indeed in the database, and since it occurred near one of the locations being investigated by police, this immediately marked it as a high-profile case to investigate. And eventually, Vishal's death was linked to a member of a predator ring, none other than Sidney Cook, the man already investigated under Operation Orchid, who had been linked previously to the ELM Guest House. As it turned out, Lenny Smith, the man who helped run the predator ring with Sidney Cook, had, at the time of the crimes, been working as a rent boy in London. This in the past had led investigators to suspect that he had been working, if you get what I'm saying, inside of the ELM Guest House. But in 2014, during that operation, when investigators headed into the files to look for the evidence that was gathered during Operation Orchid that linked Sidney Cook, his cohort Lenny Smith, and the ELM Guest House together, they discovered that the information was once again missing. Once again, it had vanished from the police evidence lockers and from filing cabinets. No explanation was given. It was simply gone. So now we have a number of different investigations that went nowhere, a number of different leads that were never followed up on, a metric ton of evidence that disappeared from official filing cabinets and evidence locker rooms. But who were the victims of the ELM Guest House? Who were the kids who testified that they had seen what had happened on the inside and lived to tell the tale? Well, we know a few of their names. One is Peter Hatton Bornshin. Peter Hatton Bornshin had a tragic life. He was only a baby when his father died in a tragic car accident, and Peter, at age 12, along with his older brother, was given to social services by his stepfather after his mother unalived herself and his family fell apart. It was at this point in his life when Peter was put into the Grafton Close Children's Home, which was a hotbed of abuse, and then trafficked off of the property and into the ELM Guest House to be used by politicians, celebrities, and the like. And these violent assaults and torture would have a permanent, lasting effect on Peter. Later on in his life, it was discovered that Peter had a personality disorder, and at one point, his own caseworker stated on an official report that they believed that his mental health issues were partially due to the abuse he suffered at a young age. Peter unalived himself when he was 28 years old, and his case became a part of Operation Fern Bridge in 2013, which aimed to look at the historic crimes associated with the ELM Guest House and Grafton Close Children's School. And sadly, as with some victims of they sometimes themselves eventually become a and the cycle continues. An individual from Child Protection was well aware that Peter was his own children and was trying to get him arrested at the time that he unalived himself. According to the Scottish Daily Mail, quote, "A child protection campaigner told us this week Peter was a victim at ELM Guest House in the 70s, but by the time I knew of him in the 80s, he was an He had been groomed as a child, but he crossed the line at some stage. As an adult, he was organizing the of kids. By the mid-1980s, we were pushing for his arrest. We weren't treating him as a victim anymore. Then there's the older brother of Peter Hatton Bornstein, whose name has not been publicly revealed. Peter's older brother was 13 at the time the started for him at the Grafton Close Children's Home and at the Elm Guest House. He stated that the boys were given alcohol before being stripped down and forced to pose for nude photographs while wearing skimpy fairy costumes. Some of the men that he stated he was by that were present at these photo and alcohol parties were MPs or British politicians. And according to him, after the photographs were taken, the group of men would then proceed to the boys. Eventually, he received a payoff from Richmond Council after he complained about his treatment at the care home, and that was the end of his story. Then we have Richard Kerr, the most vocal advocate for justice for victims of the Elm Guest House. Richard had a tragic life as well. When he was very young, he was first at the Kincora Boys Home in Belfast in the 1970s, a story which I covered as one of the first episodes of the Conspiracy Files. Then when he was a bit older, Richard was hand-selected along with 2 other boys in 1977 to be sent to London to be by men at the Elm Guest House.
My name is Richard Kerr, and I'm 53, and I believe my first time being trafficked to England was on February of 1977.
As a teenager, he was introduced to the world of Westminster. He says he was trafficked from Northern Ireland and that this picture was taken by one of his abusers.
I was used as a boy toy. I was an object, a sexual object. They were men who had control and power over others.
They were politicians, you believe?
Some I do. This is the place that I remember very well, and the memories I tried to block many, many years ago.
How do you feel about the boy you remember here?
Very emotional. Very painful. Sorry. Scared.
Throughout his life, Richard tried to speak out about the horrific abuse that he was suffering at the hands of England's most elite, but as he stated during this interview multiple times, detectives or other agents from the government would show up and intimidate him into silence.
They told me to stop talking about Kincora. They intimidated me here. There is another place in Preston, Lancashire. They told me they could put me away.
But speaking of the Elm Guest House, Richard still hates reliving the things that he endured while there. The most violent experience that Richard ever experienced at the hands of his abusers, according to him, took place at the Elm Guest House, where he was tied up with his hands behind his back while men took photographs.
I was tied up here. I do remember that. I don't know why I was tied up, but I was tied up with my hands behind my back. I do remember that. Laying down and he took photographs. Other men were here. Other men came into the room. It just wasn't this one man. There were other men here. I don't mean to be this way. It's just holding on to all this sometimes. And I can't believe this happened.
Another location in the story that we haven't really talked about yet was Dolphin Square, an apartment complex in London that is still, to this day, almost exclusively rented out to the British elite, parliament members, politicians, celebrity, and the like. It's also a location rumored to be another hotspot for predators to bring their child victims to. Jimmy Savile himself had an office there where crimes are said to have occurred, and it's been alleged that CP has been filmed and produced at Dolphin Square. Abuse has happened at Dolphin Square, and even that snuff films, or videos where children were and then afterwards murdered, have also been filmed at Dolphin Square, and Richard claims he was taken there too.
One of the locations he claims he was taken to in a taxi was an apartment complex in the heart of Westminster known as Dolphin Square. It is now at the nexus of the Met Police's Operation Midland, which is also looking into alleged murders.
I could have been 16, 15, 17. I remember going in with this guy, and he told me to sit down, relax, and explain about his glasses. And he said he had a Waterford crystal, and he wanted me to have a brandy, and we had more brandy. And then we had sexual encounter in here.
Did you ever meet any of the men that have been named to have had alleged contact with young boys?
I just don't want to get into that right now. I really don't. I'm talking to my attorneys, legal.
And why is that? Why don't you want to talk about it yet?
I'm still concerned. There are some people still around, and I'm concerned. Most of these people were very well off, but most of them had positions of power that had influence over others.
The other two boys that were trafficked with Richard from Ireland to England to the Elm guest house, according to Richard, ended up unaliving themselves. And that's why he wants to continue fighting this fight.
It's not about me. It's about the voices that didn't have a voice. And I don't know, my spirit is driving me. I want those who are responsible brought to justice. Yes, we can't fail in this. We just can't. If we do this now, if we fail on this, we are allowing this to continue, that they can get away from this because people have decided to turn the other way.
Another victim of the Elm guest house that's documented was the young boy found on the night of the 1982 raid, but his name was never released and his story was never fully told. But according to reports, the young boy had been multiple times by predators while in his room at the Elm guest house. There's also a Lee, a 16-year-old masseuse who was forced into at the Elm guest house in 1982. He was arrested at the same time as Carol and Henry Cassier, the owners of the Elm guest house, on the night of the initial police raid. However, the official charges against him were dropped, and it should be noted that charges were never filed against those he claimed victimized him. Lee has also stated in the past that he was by one of the undercover police officers while they were there investigating the guest house, and that's one of the reasons why the charges of solicitation against him were dropped by prosecutors. The police were told that they would be implicating themselves if the charges weren't dropped. In a news article from April 2014, it was noted that Lee was thinking about taking action against the police for their actions as agent provocateurs and sending in undercover officers and conducting a raid. As he was only 16 during these events, he was, just to be very clear, legally considered to be a child at the time of his. There's also an unnamed businessman who came forward around 2014 when he was 46 and claimed that he was at the Elm guest house. And the details of the crimes against him are violent, disturbing, and horrifying. This same anonymous victim claimed that they witnessed the murders of 3 children at the guest house and stated that one of the boys he saw being killed was strangled by a conservative MP that people in Brittain would recognize. But overall, who was involved in the cover-ups of the Elm guest house? For one, for sure, was police agencies. There were allegations related to the Elm guest house that included police misconduct regarding their investigation at the guest house. Obviously, with all the documents that went missing, the shifting stories, the denial of the truth, the unwillingness to investigate leads and prosecute predators, and so much more, it's pretty obvious that the police were seemingly trying their hardest not to investigate the guest house. It's also thought that the findings of these investigations, even if they were actually completed with integrity, were sealed and covered up before they could ever be brought to a prosecution or revealed to the public. One of the main cover-up theories is that evidence related to Leon Brittain, the Attorney General of the UK, being at the guest house was suppressed. Obviously, Leon Brittain is a man that had many allegations made against him during his life, and he was the guy who the dossier disappeared under. It should also be noted that, according to some testimony gathered during these investigations, Leon Brittain's attendance at the home was noted by residents of the area where the guest house was located. That's right, residents who lived in the area of the Elm guest house had seen who they thought was Leon in the area at or around the times of some of these alleged crimes. Also, in response to a Freedom of Information request in 2014, the Crown Prosecution Service provided a letter stating that they destroyed a file of Elm guest house suspects and evidence in the year 2007. Weird. Why 2007? I don't know. That's weird to me. It's just some random ass year that they decided, hey, let's just destroy some evidence. It's also known that there was complicitness in this affair from MI5, the British equivalent of the CIA. It's public information and widely known that the Director of Public Prosecutions lied to journalists about why they chose not to charge Cyril Smith with crimes against children throughout his life, even though he had been arrested multiple times for the offenses and had dozens of allegations made against him. When questioned, the Director of Public Prosecution stated that the case was not referred to MI5 when it was referred to them. He also stated that they decided not to follow the information as a serious lead because their role was to defend the realm. But seemingly, defending the realm, as he actually stated, didn't mean defending the children of England. It meant defending the power of the crown and the corruption behind it. In July of 2014, ex-Conservative cabinet minister Lord Tebbit stated that there may have been a political cover-up over happening during the 1980s in England. Lord Tebbit stated that at the time, the mindset amongst government officials was to protect the system and not to investigate too deeply into unpleasant allegations. He also said it was almost unconscious. It was the thing people did at the time. Lord Tebbit's statements were made after the Home Office admitted that 114 files related to historic organized from 1979 to 99 couldn't be located. They were thought to be missing or just destroyed. So, just to reiterate, towards the end of this whole thing, children were trafficked into England in one way or another, whether from foreign countries or different boys' homes in different areas, like the Kincora Boys' Home, and were then taken to the ELM guest house to be used like toys by the wealthy and powerful British elite. One of the main places that these children were taken from was the Grafton Close Children's Home in London, which was later found out to be a horrific institution full of abuse all on its own. We could do an entire episode just on that complex alone, about the many employees that were discovered to have been child predators and the horrific things that happened there, but that's for another day. There was also the Dolphin Square apartment complex in London, located near Parliament, where victims have alleged that and murder took place. But according to the authorities, remember, nothing happened at the ELM guest house. That's still the official story. No one was ever victimized. No VIPs were ever there in the home. It was just a hotel. Remember that quote from 2019 when Metropolitan Police Commander Neil Jerome, who oversaw one of the many operations tasked with exposing the guest house, spoke to the independent inquiry into child stating that, quote, no credible victim has ever come forward alleging a specific offense suffered whilst at ELM guest house, end quote, and that no prominent person had ever been conclusively identified as having a child there. It's infuriating, isn't it? Even Haroon Kassir, the former owner of the guest house, has maintained his own silence on the matter over the last few decades, even after his wife was most likely murdered to keep her silent. Haroon was quoted somewhat recently as saying, quote, ELM guest house was just a guest house. There were never any politicians or any parties. That is why there have never been any convictions or anything like that. There is nothing else to add. End quote. It also should be noted that the Wikipedia page about this whole thing is corrupt itself. The page is titled The ELM Guest House Hoax. On this joke of a Wikipedia page, they gloss over the historical allegations about the ELM Guest House and solely focus on the operations carried out in the name of justice. In fact, even though the first 3/4 of this episode was about allegations and evidence that were made and happened before the year 2014, there are only a few sentences on the Wikipedia page about all those allegations, and they mostly seek to discredit them. But the real reason why I believe that those allegations, that testimony, and that evidence wasn't included on the page is because that information just can't easily be debunked. But there's another part of this entire saga that was highly publicized that I haven't mentioned yet. Well, that's because it's the part of this story that debunkers frequently cite as the reason why none of this stuff is real and why none of this stuff ever happened. In 2014, a man named Carl Beach, initially known under the pseudonym Nick, came forward to the authorities and to the press in England and falsely accused prominent figures of abusing him, which led to widespread investigations and news reporting. Carl claimed to have been abused by a VIP predator gang for over a decade at locations like the ELM Guest House and Dolphin Square, and even alleged that he had witnessed the murders of some children during this cycle of torture. These allegations prompted another investigation to be started called Operation Midland, with its express intent having been to investigate high-profile officials. However, a subsequent inquiry by Richard Henriques determined that Carl's claims were completely baseless. He wasn't even in the country at the times of these claims. There was just definitive proof that this was impossible to have happened to him, and Metropolitan Police Commissioner Hogan Howe issued apologies to the accused and to Leon Brittain's widow for the harm caused by the false allegations. In 2019, Carl Beach stood trial on 12 charges of perverting the course of justice and one of fraud, which he denied. Before the trial began, he pleaded guilty to offenses, revealing he had been involved in creating and sharing images. During the same period, he fabricated his allegations. On July 22, 2019, Carl Beach was found guilty of lying and sentenced to 18 years in prison on the 26th of July. So at the end of this story, some random predator came forward, made a bunch of completely falsified allegations with no evidence, was called out for lying to the press and to the authorities, and was then arrested. And that was the seal or stamp of approval from the higher-ups on the cover-up itself. At that point, the cover-up was complete. Now, the authorities had a boogeyman whom they could pin all of the false allegations on. And now, anytime the Elm Guest House is brought up, conversation is shut down immediately because of this one single guy and his set of accusations. It was a perfect storm for the British government when you think about it. Some guy comes along, makes all of the accusers and victims look bad, and practically hands them a reason why they can call all of this a fake hoax. It's almost as if this man, Carl Beach, was hired by the government itself to do all of this so that they could find a scapegoat to pin all the false accusations on and move on. It's almost as if Carl could have been working for the government all along to undermine the victims, to create a disinformation campaign, to delegitimize all of the real evidence and reporting. But I don't know. I might just be going crazy. Ha ha ha. It should be said though that all of the evidence presented in this episode before I ever mentioned Carl Beach has had nothing to do with him, with his allegations, or with Operation Midland. In fact, I'm not going to discuss him any further in order to not taint this episode and the legitimate documented proof of these allegations that I've already shown y'all. If you were to go through and review the Wikipedia page tied to the Elm Guest House, you'll notice that it lacks almost all of the information that was outlined here in this show. Victims were ignored, statements were forgotten, newspaper and police reports were completely disregarded, and by completely ignoring alleged victim statements or not even mentioning them, and declaring the Elm Guest House allegations a hoax, whoever the phantom user is that has kept up the facade of innocence on the Elm Guest House Wikipedia page is committing a massive disservice to the innumerable legitimate victims. Wikipedia can be edited. It can be edited by anyone, including governments. I'm sure some people do create false statements to pass blame, but ignoring actual accounts of predators and predator rings to make a government look innocent seems like a crime in itself. But to end this episode, we have to explore one more final mysterious clue in the Elm Guest House saga that taints the entire thing with a more darker motive: Spartacus International. In June of 1982, when the police first raided the Elm Guest House, it was noted and reported at the time that there was a sign hanging outside of the home which read, "Spartacus Club, welcome." That's weird, right? What does that mean? Well, what's even weirder is the fact that Spartacus International was none other than a massive international predator CP production and snuff film ring that had been operated by an ex-British national named John Stamford, who had been forced to flee England because of his outspoken beliefs that boy-man relationships were completely normal and his disturbing checkered criminal past. You see, John's evil actions had finally caught up to him, and he had been recently charged with operating a CP service through the mail in England. But before he could be brought to justice, he fled to another country, escaped the authorities, and started up his horrific child abuse CP ring once again. But this thing gets even crazier. Remember Frank Sheldon, the multimillionaire owner of North Fox Island, the original American Epstein Island that I've talked about extensively on all my social media? Well, for a refresher, if you don't remember, Frank Sheldon ran one of the largest predator and snuff film rings in the entire United States, with one of its headquarters having been located on a private island named North Fox Island in Lake Michigan. For an episode of my show, The Paranormal Files, I actually traveled all the way out to that island in Michigan to expose the horrific things that happened there, and I've been on the trail of Frank Sheldon for years now with my personal research. Frank Sheldon, similar to John Stamford, also operated a CP service through the mail, where predators across the globe could donate to Frank's fake charity in exchange for the materials to be mailed to them. When police finally caught wind of what Frank Sheldon was doing in Michigan, a raid was planned, but before the search and arrest warrants could be executed against Frank, he was tipped off by somebody inside and managed to flee the country, never having been held accountable for his crimes. And officially, according to Wikipedia and the authorities here in America, that's where the story of Frank Sheldon ends. But his story definitely didn't end there. In fact, in reality, that was where the horrifically evil saga of Frank Sheldon really began. After fleeing the United States, Frank landed in Amsterdam and took up residence there. And one of the things that he immediately began to work on in his new home country was the establishment of a brand new pro-predator magazine that he self-published, titled PAN, or Alert News, a magazine about boy love. which he published under the fake pen name Frank Torrey. And Pan, Frank Sheldon's new magazine that he had just begun publishing after he escaped justice in America, was published in Europe by a publishing house run by none other than John Stamford, the man who had escaped justice in the United Kingdom by fleeing the country after being charged with operating a through-the-mail CP delivery service. It seems as though Frank Sheldon and John Stamford had committed the exact same crimes and had escaped their home countries in the exact same manner. It was practically written in the stars that these two predators were meant to be the most evil of best friends. And when John Stamford eventually started up Spartacus International, a company engineered specifically to serve predators as their clientele, Frank Sheldon became intimately involved. Spartacus International was a network of locations and people that essentially served young children to men on silver platters for a price. They even published guidebooks on child tourism that instructed predators on how to travel to foreign countries, how to find children to groom and victimize, and how to get away with their crimes. According to an article published in the Daily Times in 1995, quote, NAMBLA, or the North American Boy Lovers Association, officials also don't deny that several of the group's members belong to Club Spartacus. The names of the Westchester members of Club Spartacus were discovered along with thousands of other men and women in the London computers of a British man, John Stamford, 55, who was identified by authorities as a Club Spartacus official, according to FBI and other federal law enforcement records. Club Spartacus, according to one investigative document, is a clandestine organization that operates through a box number in London. Vital information on each member, stored on a computer and guarded with secret codes, include their sexual preferences, the desired age of the children, and preferred country of origin. Members receive personal lists of children, mainly from outside Europe, and are invited to select a child and indicate the choice to a local middleman. Notice how they note that the operations of Club Spartacus were operated through a box number in London, same city as the ELM guest house, to which John Stamford has already been connected in paperwork and documents. So just to reiterate, Frank Sheldon was producing CP and allegedly financing snuff films in America. He then escaped to Amsterdam. There, he linked up with another guy who was producing CP and snuff films as well. They then started publishing a Predator magazine together and working on a clandestine organization called Club Spartacus or Spartacus International, an organization formed in order to find and groom victims to be provided to other predators across the world. Spartacus Club also had a headquarters in London. Now, we need to hop back for a moment. Remember that border agent that allegedly stopped Leon Brittain, the British Attorney General, at the border and discovered that he was trying to bring CP into the country from Amsterdam? It should be noted that's where Sheldon and Stamford were located at the time. Well, in 1982, journalists uncovered another incident, a similar incident, involving a man who was stopped at the border named Russell Tricker, whose films and videotapes were confiscated and contained violent CP. These violent CP tapes, videos, and photos were confiscated by a customs officer named Solanke at the port of Dover. Tricker, the guy who was arrested, ran a service called Toff's Travel, a coach service known for smuggling boys into Amsterdam during the 1980s to be used and by men. And Russell Tricker was linked on paper to Spartacus International commercial agent Peter Glencross. Peter Glencross himself has been named in multiple documents as being a person who frequently visited the ELM guest house. Among the confiscated materials found at the border amongst Russell Tricker's violent CP was a film canister labeled LB, which sparked speculation that it involved Leon Brittain, the British Attorney General, and the allegations of abuse that at the time had begun to surround him. According to the official story, though, this connection was ultimately incorrect. You can believe whatever you want about that. But the border officer, Solanke, who'd confiscated all of this stuff, citing the Official Secrets Act, declined to comment to the journalist who asked him about the confiscation and what exactly they found, but he did mention another incident that he knew about that involved Leon Brittain, the British Attorney General, and allegations of him being a predator and materials that were found on his presence, which he confirmed during an interview with Operation Fernbridge detectives years later. Well, the connections between all of these individuals just get stronger and darker. As it turned out, Carol Kassir, the woman who unalived herself, the former owner and operator of the ELM guest house, had died and her death was investigated. And authorities at the time suspected that she had been connected to none other than Sidney Cook, who we discussed earlier in this episode, the predator who ran the Predator gang and supposedly oversaw the of 20 children on film. And the footage of these according to inside sources, was to be sold as snuff films for a high price. Weird though that Carol Cassier has been linked to Sidney Cook through different connections and documents. The investigation of the link between Sidney Cook's snuff films and the Elm Guest House was launched after the discovery of the crimes of another separate predator that I've previously covered on the Conspiracy Files, Warwick Spinks. If you don't remember, Warwick Spinks was a man who was funding, procuring boys for, and selling snuff films on the black market in Amsterdam, where Frank Sheldon and John Stamford were headquartered at the same time. And all of these people were indeed interconnected. It seems that John Stamford, the founder and operator of Spartacus International, knew Frank Sheldon, and that the two of them knew people at the Elm Guest House, and that those people at the Elm Guest House knew Sidney Cook, and that Sidney Cook also knew Warwick Spinks. It's a big trail, a big red line that goes through all these people. But back to John Stamford and Spartacus Club. A curious note appeared in a German tabloid in the year 1992 when the following excerpt was published. Scotland Yard, the famous London police, has a terrible suspicion. Stamford filmed 20 boys after in England. On these perverse films, after the children have been repeatedly by men, they have been So John Stamford was himself accused of creating snuff films like it was alleged before, and John Stamford's best friend's buddy with Frank Sheldon, who was accused of creating snuff films. And people at the Elm Guest House have been accused of creating snuff films, but there's no evidence of that. There's no link. Well, a few years prior to this article being published in that German tabloid, in July of 1990, a teenager named Andrew Ash spoke out about what he had witnessed at the guest house. At the time of his allegations, he was staying with Mary Moss, the whistleblower who we discussed at the beginning of this story, the woman who received materials from Carol Cassier, who published lists and linked documents, and who had spoken out against the Elm Guest House for decades. In July of 1990, Andrew, when he was talking to Mary Moss, claimed he was taken to Amsterdam in 1988 by a group of men from London and forced to film in a warehouse where a 12-year-old boy was successively by 12 men with chains by a motorcycle and his body dumped in a canal. And remember, Andrew himself was an alleged victim of the group at the Elm Guest House. Andrew serves to connect the rings of snuff film producers that are operated both in England and in Amsterdam and the Elm Guest House. Andrew is a link between Warwick Spinks, the guy who I already talked about in another video, and the Elm Guest House. He's the link between Sidney Cook and Warwick Spinks and the Guest House and Sheldon and all these people. So all this information raises so many questions. Was the Elm Guest House a venue where snuff films were recorded? Were some of the boys victimized at the guest house, then taken off property to be on camera? Was Martin Allen, the chauffeur's son, abducted, victimized, and then killed as a part of a snuff film? Did Vishal Malhotra suffer the same fate? Remember, as noted, the Elm Guest House came fully equipped with a video production studio. This was reported in the press at the time and noted not only in police reports, but in the actual advertisements of the Elm Guest House itself that they published in newspapers. And if you still don't think that there was any connection here, remember that sign that hung outside of the Elm Guest House on the day of the raid. Spartacus Club, welcome. So, as you can see, clearly spelled out within this web of interconnected evil, there's a pattern, a flow to the abuse, and a network of predators that remains officially uninvestigated, unconnected, and unreported upon to this very day. Why was there no justice in this case? Why have investigators never taken a hard look at just what happened at the Elm Guest House? Why do authorities refuse to listen to and believe victims? What dark truths are they afraid would be exposed if this were all to ever come to light? There's a lot of information out there about the Elm Guest House and what went on there. With the well-known history of VIPs committing crimes against children in the UK, it's no surprise that information time and time again disappeared in this case. But here are some of my closing thoughts. Even with so many victims making statements, they weren't taken seriously. Individuals like Cyril Smith, who was a known predator, still got and continue to get knighted. That in itself provides insight into how ingrained, and I hate to say, accepted predatorial behavior is in some of the higher class social circles in the UK. Take Sir Jimmy Savile, a BBC children's television presenter who had 450 victims, mostly young boys and girls as young as 8 over a period of 50 years. Authorities laughed at and ignored his victims until their cries eventually became too loud, too public to ignore. Or what about Operation U-Tree, which saw 18 TV presenters, comedians, DJs, and other people in show business arrested for for crimes against children? How many people over time were paid off or turned a blind eye because of the abuser's status? How many people were told to stay silent because the information may cause public outrage? How many children have to suffer abuse because it's bad press or a danger to national security if the truth gets out? How many children were victimized at the ELM guest house? And why has no one, not one single person, ever been prosecuted for it? Well, I have your answer to all those questions right here. Remember, according to the authorities in England, that's because none of what I just described to you ever really happened. It's all one big lie. And seeing these denials from the government and witnessing the lack of justice for themselves from the tips of their castles and from their lush seats in Parliament, those predators in power simply continue to look down on us normal people and laugh and smile, knowing that they got away with it. Wow. Guys, that was the longest episode I think that we've ever done. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to see the full documentary, it's going to be on my YouTube channel, The Paranormal Files. We visited the ELM guest house. We visited the Grafton Close Children's Home, and we actually were able to go inside of it. We visited Dolphin Square, and we did so much investigating on the ground in London. It's powerful. It's really powerful stuff. But anyways, thank you all so much for listening to today's episode. I really do hope, not that you enjoyed it, but this took a lot of effort to connect all of these dots. I really want to shout out Simon Dovey and his book, The Eye of the Chicken Hawk, for pointing out so much stuff, to Rebecca, who wrote some of this script with me. And yeah, this was like a 35-page script, so there was a lot of information in this. And it's all real. It's all true. You can verify all of it on the resources document in the description. But anyways, I love you guys. I'll see you next week. Keep that tinfoil hat on. Always question everything and stay suspicious.